Chapter 201. North of Hangzhou, Amarathian strike team prepares for the assault. The night was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as Captain Daniel Foster crouched behind a rock formation overlooking the Boxer encampment. The flickering glow of torches illuminated the perimeter, revealing crude wooden barricades and patrols moving in tight formations through his spyglass. Foster counted at least 30 visible guards, but he knew there were more inside. The rebels weren't amateurs. They had reinforced their defenses, expecting retaliation behind him. His 10-man team lay in wait clad in dark, padded gear designed for silent movement. They carried Amarathian-made assault rifles, each fitted with suppressors, along with sidearms and combat knives. He tapped his earpiece, whispering, "Status check. Alpha in position." Lieutenant Marcus Hale, the team's sharpshooter, responded. He was perched on a slope, his silenced rifle trained on the encampment's watchtower. "Bravo in position." Sergeant Elias Boone, the demolitions expert, replied. He had already set 2 small explosives on a stack of wooden crates near the east entrancia distraction. If needed. "Charlie in position." Corporal Luis Vega, the team's close-quarters specialist, whispered. He was nearest to the prisoner tent, waiting for the go-ahead. Foster exhaled slowly. They had one shot at this. A failed extraction would mean immediate execution for the hostages. He checked his pocket watch. 0100 hours. Right on schedule. We move. The first phase was eliminating the outer patrols. Hale lined up his shot from the ridge, adjusting his aim against the wind. The guard in the watchtower leaned on his rifle. Yawning, Hale squeezed the trigger pitch FFT. The silenced round struck the rebel's temple, and he slumped forward. His body fell over the ledge, landing in a heap without a sound. "Tower down." Foster signaled forward. 2 guards patrolled the main entrance, their attention focused on the forest edge. Bad mistake. Hale adjusted his rifle pitch FFT. The first rebel collapsed before the second could react. Luis Vega lunged from the shadows, wrapping an arm around the man's neck and driving a dagger under his ribs. The rebel's body jerked before going limp. Entrance clear. Foster gestured for his men to advance. They slipped through the wooden barricades, keeping to the shadows. Amber sat upright as she heard something unusual. Silence moments ago. She could hear the Boxer guards exchanging whispers, their boots crunching against the dirt now. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. She turned to the other hostages, European diplomats, Chinese officials, merchants, all watching with fearful anticipation. Then a gloved hand slipped through the tent's opening. A blade flashed in the dim light. The first Boxer guard collapsed before he could react. A silenced round lodged in his skull. 2 figures emerged from the darkness, rifles raised. Amber's breath caught. Amarathian soldiers. One of them, Luis Vega, pressed a finger to his lips. "Stay quiet, we're getting you out." Amber nodded, whispering, "The others. We're getting them all. Stay low." The hostages crawled forward, their movements hurried but controlled. A second Boxer guard appeared, rifle raised in alarm. Vega spun, his silencer spitting 2 rounds. HFFT. The guard collapsed onto a pile of crates. The hostages gasped, but Vega didn't break stride. "Move now." Foster had expected to stay in the shadows, but an alert Boxer rebel had spotted one of his men dragging a body into the darkness. "Intruders!" The camp erupted into shouts. Boone lighted up. A moment later, boom. "Stay updated with Novelbin." Calm. The east entrance erupted into flames, sending wooden shrapnel flying. The explosion was small, but it threw the Boxers into disarray. Foster shouldered his rifle, squeezing the trigger in controlled bursts. Silent, precise. Rebels dropped before they could rally. Amber felt Luis Vega's grip tighten on her arm as they rushed toward the treeline. Behind them, the rebels scrambled to organize a defense. More explosions rang out. Controlled detonations meant to disrupt the enemy. A group of hostages stumbled, and Vega turned back, firing 2 rounds into an approaching Boxer. "Keep moving." Amber's lungs burned as they sprinted toward the rendezvous point. She glanced back. Foster and his men covered the retreat, firing into the encampment with ruthless precision. But then a Boxer war horn sounded from the distance. Amber's stomach clenched. Reinforcements. Foster's radio crackled. "Command, we have hostages clear, but we have incoming." A voice responded, calm but firm. "Extraction in 2 minutes. Hold the line." 2 minutes. A Boxer officer charged forward, Sword raised, Foster leveled his pistol. Pitch FFT. The officer crumpled. Another boxer fired a musket. The shot went wide. But Vega stumbled as a splintered bullet grazed his arm. Amber grabbed Vega's rifle, stabilizing it. Don't stop now. The strike team dug in, holding position as the remaining hostages boarded extraction wagons. The boxers regrouped, rallying near the burning supply depot. More war cries echoed. Time's up. Go! Foster shouted. The team fell back toward the extraction zone, firing in quick bursts to suppress pursuit. As they reached the designated clearing, the low hum of approaching engines. A British armored vehicle tore through the underbrush, mounted machine guns roaring. Foster exhaled. Reinforcements. Right on time. He grabbed Amber's wrist. Get in now. She climbed aboard as the strike team piled in behind her. The vehicle lurched forward, kicking up dirt as they sped away from the battlefield. Behind them, the boxer camp burned, its forces shattered hours later. Amber sat inside the British military outpost, wrapped in a heavy blanket, exhausted, but alive. Foster stood nearby, speaking into a radio. Hostages secured, mission complete. The line crackled. Then Matthew Hesch's voice, tight with emotion. Thank you. Bring her home. Amber closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to breathe. She was safe. But you came only for me? That was the scope of the mission. To rescue you, Your Grace. But there are still hostages. What do you think will happen if one of them were extracted by an unknown force? Their lives will be in danger. You are the only one that matters, Your Grace. Amber's jaw tightened as she threw off the blanket and stood, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. That's unacceptable, she snapped, her voice cutting through the tense air. You rescued me, but you left the others to die. Foster exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Ma'am, we didn't have a choice. If we stayed any longer, we'd all be dead, including you. Amber's fists clenched. And now you expect me to sit here while they execute the rest? Vega, still tending to his wound, looked up. It's not that simple, Your Grace. A second extraction isn't in the orders. The risk is too high. Amber turned to Foster. Then I'm giving you new orders. We're going back. Foster's expression hardened. With all due respect, ma'am, you don't have the authority to make that call. Amber's glare was icy. Then who does? A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Foster sighed. The President. Amber's heart pounded. She knew what she had to do. Then get me a damn radio. Chapter 202. Amber gripped the cold metal of the radio receiver, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. The room was dimly lit, the hum of telegraph machines filling the silence as Captain Foster stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her closely. A crackle filled the air as the connection was established. Then, a familiar voice tight with concern came through. Amber! Her throat tightened at the sound of Matthew's voice. She had longed to hear him, to tell him she was safe. But there was no time for that now. Matthew, listen to me. They only rescued me. The others are still there. A pause. Then, his voice, controlled but firm. The mission was to extract you. You're safe now. That's all that matters. Amber's grip on the receiver tightened. No, it's not. She took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Matthew, those people were with me. They are diplomats, Chinese officials, civilians. The boxers will kill them all because of my rescue. Amber, you don't understand. We had one chance to get you out. A second operation risks everything. She knew he wasn't dismissing her. He was weighing the risks, just as he always did, but she couldn't let him look at this as just another tactical decision. Matthew, you are the president of Amarathia. You have the power to do something. Are you telling me that after all we've fought for, after everything we've stood for, we're just going to leave them behind? A heavy silence. She could imagine him sitting in the war room, jaw clenched, surrounded by advisors telling him to stay out of it, experience news stories with Novelbin. Calm, Amber, this isn't just about our principles. If we send more forces, we're risking war with China. The imperial court is already walking a fine line. If they see Amarathian troops operating inside their borders without authorization, then get the authorization. Amber snapped. Talk to the emperor. Tell him we can work together to take the camp. Another pause. We already tried. The imperial court is divided. Some of them want to help, others fear the Boxers will retaliate against them for working with us. Amber closed her eyes, frustration boiling inside her. So what, we do nothing? Just let them die. Amber. His voice was softer now, but still uncertain. She took a breath, her voice steady, unwavering. Matthew, you know me, you know I wouldn't ask for this unless I knew it was the right thing to do. If I were still there, would you have left me behind? The silence stretched, then no. She swallowed hard, then don't leave them behind either. Another long pause. She could hear muffled voices in the background, his advisors, his generals. Then Matthew spoke again, his tone resolute. Give me 1 hour. Amber let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That's all I ask. The line went dead. President Matthew Hesh stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Around him, his top military officials sat in tense silence. General Carter Hayes leaned forward, arms crossed. Sir, with all due respect. A second operation is reckless. The first one barely got out without casualties. If we go back in, we'll be facing a fully mobilized Boxer force, not a camp caught off guard. Matthew tapped his fingers against the polished wood. Amber is right. If we don't act, we'll be complicit in their deaths. Secretary of State Richard Alden adjusted his glasses. Sir, the British and French are preparing for a full-scale intervention, but they won't move fast enough to save the hostages if we go in now. We could set a dangerous precedent. Amarathian forces operating on Chinese soil without explicit approval. Matthew turned to Ambassador William Thornton, who had just arrived from Beijing. What's the Emperor's stance? Thornton sighed, conflicted. He wants the Boxers crushed, but he can't be seen as siding with foreign powers. If we go in alone, it might force his hand, but if we wait for him to act, the hostages will be dead. Matthew exhaled sharply. So we have no choice. General Hayes shook his head. Sir, I have to object. Our men are exhausted and the Boxers know we're coming. This isn't a stealth operation anymore, it's war. Matthew's voice was calm but unwavering. Then we fight. A heavy silence settled over the room, then he spoke again. I want a joint operation with the British and Japanese. We hit the camp with precision, coordinated strikes, no hesitation. Hayes clenched his jaw, but he nodded. Understood, sir. Ill-informed the teams. Matthew straightened. This isn't just a rescue, this is a message. The world needs to see that we don't abandon our own. We move at dawn. Beijing, British military outpost 0500 hours. Amber stood on the balcony of the outpost, watching the first light of dawn break over the horizon. She had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. Foster approached. A fresh bandage wrapped around his forearm from the earlier skirmish. Your husband gave the order, he said, leaning against the railing. They're mobilizing now. Amber exhaled. Thank you. Foster gave a half smile. Don't thank me yet, we still have to survive this. The sound of approaching footsteps made them turn. A British officer stepped forward. The operation is a go. Amarathian, British, and Japanese forces are assembling. We're hitting the camp in 3 hours. Amber nodded. I want to be there. Foster frowned. That's not happening. I'm not asking for permission. Her voice was firm. I know the layout of the camp. I know where they keep the hostages. You need me. Foster sighed. You're not trained for combat. No, but I am trained to survive, and I won't sit here while others fight for me. Sorry, Your Grace, but you were not really allowed in the operation as you were civilian, and don't worry, we made our own observations. Amber sighed. Very well, if it's the case then I won't force myself. Good luck to you and your men and to your partners. Chapter 203. The sky was still dark, the first hints of dawn creeping along the horizon. Captain Daniel Foster crouched behind a large boulder, peering through his spyglass at the Boxer encampment. The terrain was rough, with uneven slopes and thick underbrush. But it provided ample cover for their approach. The Boxers had changed their tactics. After Amber's escape, they had reinforced their defenses. More guards patrolled the perimeter, torches lighting the paths between tents. The hostages were no longer scattered. They had been moved to a central holding area, heavily guarded and encircled by wooden barricades. Foster lowered his spyglass and turned to Lieutenant Marcus Hale, the sharpshooter. How many? Hale adjusted his rifle sight. At least 40 guards visible, probably more inside. Sergeant Elias Boone, the demolitions expert, scoffed. They're expecting trouble. They should, Foster muttered. To his left, a British captain knelt beside him, studying the camp. The Japanese will strike from the east, the Amarathians from the south, and my men will cover the western approach. Foster nodded. The plan was to move in simultaneously, creating a diversion while the extraction teams went for the hostages. They had limited time. If the Boxers realized an attack was underway, they could start executing captives. He turned to his men. We go in silent until we can't. Take out as many as possible before the fireworks start. Hale chambered a round into his rifle. Let's get this done. The makeshift prison reeked of sweat and fear. Over 20 hostages, Western diplomats, Chinese officials, and civilians huddled together inside a reinforced wooden structure. A few were injured from beatings. Their expressions grim as they whispered among themselves. The leader of the boxers, Zhou Liang, paced just outside the holding area, his face dark with anger. Amber Hesch's escape had humiliated him, and he would not allow another mistake. He stopped in front of the prisoners, unsheathing his sword. The hostages tensed. "You think your foreign friends will come for you?" he sneered. "They only cared about the Amorathian woman. The rest of you are nothing." One of the European diplomats, an older Frenchman, stepped forward. "You're making a mistake, Zhou. If you execute us, the foreign powers will—" Zhou swung his sword. The Frenchman gasped as the blade sliced across his arm, sending him stumbling backward. "The foreign powers will do nothing," Zhou growled. "They will hesitate, they will talk, and by the time they decide to act, you'll all be dead." A murmur of fear rippled through the hostages. Zhou turned to his men. "Kill one every hour. Let the foreigners find corpses when they arrive." The guards nodded, dragging one of the trembling hostages toward the execution area, but before the first blow could be struck, Phd. A silence round struck one of the executioners between the eyes. He collapsed instantly. Zhou spun around. "What Phd?" A second shot, another boxer fell, then boom. The eastern side of the camp exploded in fire and smoke as the Japanese forces breached the perimeter. The boxers scrambled, shouting in confusion. Foster's team moved in from the south, eliminating the sentries before they could raise the alarm. Hale dropped another guard from his vantage point. "Perimeter clear." "Move in," Foster ordered. The team advanced, their silenced rifles picking off boxers as they neared the hostage area. Boone lobbed a small explosive toward a supply crate, creating another distraction. Enjoy new stories from Novelbin. The explosion rocked the ground, shaking the wooden structure. The hostages gasped, some covering their heads. A British soldier burst through the door, rifle raised. "We're getting you out." Relief flooded the prisoners' faces as more operatives poured in, cutting bindings and tending to the wounded. One of the captured Chinese officials turned to an Amorathian soldier. "They will not let us escape without a fight." "We're counting on that," the soldier replied, handing him a pistol. Outside, chaos erupted as the boxers rallied. Zhou Liang barked orders, drawing his pistol. "Kill them all. Hold the camp." Foster spotted him from across the field. "Take out their leader." Hale adjusted his aim, steadying his rifle. Phd. Zhou staggered as the bullet punched into his shoulder. He collapsed, clutching the wound, before dragging himself behind cover. "Not dead," Hale muttered. "No time, keep pushing forward." Foster ordered. More explosions lit the night as the British and Japanese forces overwhelmed the remaining boxers. Foster and his team reached the hostages, helping the wounded move. "Extraction is coming," he radioed. 5 minutes. The sound of galloping horses filled the air. "Boxer reinforcements, here they come." Boone shouted. The Amorathian and British soldiers dug in, firing controlled bursts as the enemy surged toward them. "Hold the line." Foster yelled. A Japanese officer charged forward, cutting down a boxer with his saber. "Push them back." The hostages were ushered toward the rendezvous point as the last of the defenders held their ground. "Get them out now." The sound of distant engines signaled the arrival of armored transport vehicles. Soldiers covered the retreat, ensuring no hostage was left behind. Zhou Liang, wounded and enraged, crawled toward a fallen rifle. He lifted it. Aiming at the retreating hostages, a single shot rang out. Hale lowered his rifle. "Now he's dead." As the last of the hostages were secured, the Amorathian, British, and Japanese forces withdrew. The boxer camp, now in ruins, burned behind them. Amber stood at the edge of the outpost, watching the approaching convoy as Foster and his team emerged. Leading the rescued prisoners, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You did it," she whispered. Foster nodded, exhausted but satisfied. "They're safe." Hours later, Matthew Hesch received the confirmation. His joy relaxed as he leaned back in his chair. "They're safe," he murmured. His secretary, Collins, exhaled in relief. "Sir, what should we tell the press?" Matthew stood, adjusting his tie. "Tell them Amorathia does not leave anyone behind, and of course, since we are the ones who planned the operation, we have to take credit as well. You know how good this is in our optics." Chapter 204. The White House briefing room was packed. Dozens of reporters, both domestic and international, filled the seats, their pens poised over notepads, typewriters clicking, and cameras ready to capture every word. The rescue operation in China had already dominated headlines, but the world was waiting for the official statement from the president of Amorathia himself. The murmurs ceased as the doors swung open. President Matthew Hesch stepped onto the podium. His face composed, the weight of Leadership evident in his firm posture, he adjusted his tie, then rested his hands on the sides of the lectern, his gaze scanning the audience before speaking. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Over the past week, Amarathia has been closely monitoring the situation in China, particularly the escalating violence caused by the Boxer Rebellion. Many foreign diplomats, Chinese officials, and civilians were taken hostage by this radical group. Among them was my wife, Amber Hesh. A hush fell over the room. Everyone already knew this, but hearing it from him made it more real through the tireless efforts of Amarathian military personnel working in cooperation with our British and Japanese allies. We conducted a successful operation to extract the hostages from captivity. All 23 captives were rescued and have been safely transported to secure locations. A reporter from the New York Times raised his hand. Mr. President, does this mean Amarathia officially engaged in military action on Chinese soil without the explicit authorization of the Chinese government? Matthew's expression didn't waver. We engaged in a necessary humanitarian operation. Our mission was not an act of aggression against China but a decisive measure to prevent the loss of innocent lives. The Chinese government was informed of our actions and, while they did not openly sanction the operation, they did not oppose it either. The emperor is aware that the Boxers pose a greater threat to his rule than any foreign power. Another journalist from the London Times stood. Mr. President, what message does this send to other nations? Will Amarathia continue to take direct military action when hostages are taken, even if it means entering foreign territory? Matthew leaned forward. Amarathia does not negotiate with terrorists. We will not leave our people behind. This operation sends a clear message. If you threaten Amarathian lives, we will come for them. We will not abandon our diplomats, our citizens, or our allies in the face of barbarism. A murmur spread through the room. His words were bold, unwavering. A journalist from Le Figaro spoke next. Mr. President, is there any concern that this will further destabilize China? Matthew nodded slightly. The situation in China is complex. They are struggling to maintain control over its own land, and factions within the imperial court are divided on how to proceed. However, let me be clear. The Boxer Rebellion is not a legitimate uprising of the Chinese people. It is a violent insurgency that threatens both foreign and domestic stability. We urge the Chinese government to act decisively against them. If they do not, the world will. Another journalist from the Amarathian Tribune stood. And what of Mrs. Hesh? When will she be returning home? Matthew's expression softened slightly. Amber is safe. She is currently assisting in diplomatic efforts in Beijing and ensuring that relations with the Chinese court remain stable in the aftermath of this mission. She will be returning home in September. A final question came from the Washington Herald. Mr. President, what does this mean for Amarathia's foreign policy moving forward? Will we be taking a more interventionist approach? Stay connected with Novelbin. Matthew straightened. Amarathia will always act in its best interests and the interests of its people. We will not be reckless, but we will not be idle either. This is not about conquest, nor about policing the world. It is about responsibility. When Amarathia acts, we do so with purpose. With that, he stepped away from the podium, signaling the end of the conference. His advisors trailed behind him as he exited the room, leaving the press abuzz with discussion. September 19, 1893. The early autumn breeze rolled over the harbor as the Amarathian flagship, USS Resolute, pulled into port. The banners of Amarathia fluttered along the docks, and a small welcoming delegation had gathered for the arrival of one of the nation's most well-known figures. Amber Hesh stood on the deck, staring at the shoreline as the ship approached. It had been months since she last set foot in Amarathia, and though she had been focused on diplomacy in China, she had longed to return home. The moment the ship docked, a line of uniformed sailors lowered the gangplank. Amber walked down with practiced grace, her expression calm yet warm. As soon as she stepped onto solid ground, a familiar figure stood waiting. Matthew. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. Without hesitation, Amber closed the distance, and Matthew pulled her into a firm embrace. You're home, he murmured against her hair. Amber nodded against his chest. And you're here. They pulled back slightly, studying each other. There was a weariness in both their eyes, but also relief. Matthew exhaled, his hands still resting on her waist. You put me in a difficult position back there. Amber smirked. You needed a push. He chuckled. I always need a push from you. She studied him for a moment. You took credit for the operation. Matthew didn't look ashamed. Of course, we planned it, we executed it. The world needed to see that Amarathia leads from the front. Amber sighed but didn't argue. And the Chinese court? They're balancing their internal struggles. The Emperor understands why we acted, even if he can't openly support us. They're cracking down on the Boxers now. Our intervention forced their hand. Amber nodded, then it was worth it. Matthew took her hand, squeezing gently. Come on, you need rest, and I need my wife home. As they walked together toward the awaiting carriage, Amber took one last look at the ship she had arrived on, the waters beyond stretching toward distant lands. There was still much to be done, but for now she was home, and that was enough. Chapter 205. The morning sun cast golden light over the sprawling lawns of the White House. The tension of the past few months had finally begun to ease, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Matthew was not sitting in a war room, staring at maps of foreign territories or discussing diplomatic strategies. Today, he was just a husband, a father. Amber sat across from him at the breakfast table in the private dining room, sipping tea. The scent of fresh bread, eggs, and bacon filled the air. It was a simple meal, one that Matthew had barely had time to enjoy lately. You look tired, Amber remarked, setting her cup down. Matthew smirked, cutting into his eggs. I am, but at least I get to be tired at home instead of in a briefing room. Amber nodded, stirring a bit of honey into her tea. I miss this. He reached for her hand across the table, squeezing gently. So did I. How's Maverick? Well, he always stays in the crib like a baby he is. Amber chuckled. I can't wait for him to grow up. Matthew chuckled, shaking his head. Enjoy it while it lasts. Before you know it, he'll be running around the halls of the White House, getting into everything. Amber smirked. You say that like it hasn't already happened. Last week, he managed to knock over an entire stack of papers in your office. Matthew sighed. So that's where those went. I thought Collins had misplaced them. Amber laughed, setting her teacup down. He's curious about everything. He watches the world like he's trying to figure out how it all works. Matthew leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to let that sink in. He's going to be smart, I can already tell. Like his father, Amber added with a smile, or his mother, Matthew countered. A soft cry echoed from down the hall, cutting their conversation short. They both turned toward the sound before Amber stood. Speaking of which, I think our little troublemaker is awake. Matthew set his napkin down. I'll get him. Amber raised an eyebrow. You sure? You haven't had a full morning to yourself in a while. Matthew smirked as he pushed back his chair. I think I can handle my own son. Amber chuckled, watching him disappear down the hallway. Maverick's nursery. Matthew entered the nursery, greeted by the sight of his 1-year-old son standing up in his crib, gripping the wooden railing. Maverick's deep blue eyes, so much like his father's, lit up the moment he saw him. Duh. Maverick exclaimed, bouncing slightly on his feet. Matthew grinned, stepping forward and lifting his son into his arms. Good morning, little man. Did you sleep well? Maverick babbled in response, grabbing at his father's tie. Matthew laughed, letting him tug at it for a moment before prying his tiny fingers away. All right, let's not strangle your old man. Maverick only giggled in response. Matthew carried him over to the large window where the sun was now shining brightly over the White House gardens. He pointed outside. One day, you're going to be running around out there, but for now, we'll keep you from trying to climb out of your crib. Maverick responded with a delighted squeal, patting his father's cheek. Matthew sighed, pressing a kiss to his son's forehead. I missed you too, buddy. Amber appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a knowing smile. I knew you'd be wrapped around his little finger. Matthew turned, raising an eyebrow. And you aren't? Amber walked in, reaching out to run a hand over Maverick's soft curls. Completely. She kissed their son on the forehead before glancing up at Matthew. Should we take him outside? It's a beautiful day. Matthew nodded. I think that's a great idea. A short while later, the three of them strolled through the White House gardens. Maverick sat securely in Matthew's arms, reaching out toward the swaying branches of a nearby tree. You know, Amber mused, watching her son's fascination with the world around him. It's moments like this that remind me why everything we do matters. Matthew nodded, adjusting Maverick on his hip. It's easy to get caught up in everything, the meetings, the diplomacy, the decisions that affect nations, but at the end of the day, it's about family. Amber smiled, and the future we're building for him. They reached a shaded bench beneath a towering oak tree. Matthew sat down, placing Maverick on his lap while Amber settled beside him. Maverick immediately reached for a fallen leaf, his tiny fingers grasping it with intense focus. Amber watched him, amusement dancing in her eyes. See? Already curious about everything. Matthew smirked. Maybe he'll be a scientist, or a writer, or a leader. Amber leaned against his shoulder. Whatever he chooses, we'll make sure he has every opportunity. Matthew looked down at his son, who was now attempting to put the leaf in his mouth. He quickly plucked it away before Maverick could succeed. Let's just make sure he survives childhood first. Amber laughed, agreed. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the warmth of the moment. For once, the world could wait. Amber sighed contentedly, resting her head on Matthew's shoulder as Maverick continued to fidget in his father's arms. The little boy's fingers found the buttons on Matthew's coat, poking and prodding at them as if they were the most interesting thing in the world. Matthew watched his son's tiny hands with a soft smile, curious and persistent. He's definitely going to be trouble when he gets older. Amber chuckled, just like his father. Hey, Matthew protested playfully, I was a perfectly well-behaved child. Amber rolled her eyes, sure, that's what they all say. Maverick, oblivious to the conversation, clapped his hands together and giggled at the sound. The sheer joy in his face made Matthew's chest tighten. This was the part of life he never wanted to miss, the little moments. Amber watched him closely. A knowing look in her eyes, you're thinking about work again, aren't you? Matthew exhaled through his nose, I can't help it, there's always something waiting for me in that office, a crisis, a negotiation, something that demands my attention. Amber reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, but not today, today you're here with us. Matthew looked at her, then down at their son, who was now contently gnawing on his own fingers. He nodded, you're right, today, the world can wait. Amber smiled, good, because we still have the whole day ahead of us and I fully intend to make the most of it. Matthew smirked, and what exactly do you have planned? Amber grinned, well, I was thinking we'd take Maverick down to the pond and feed the ducks. Matthew raised an eyebrow and risk him throwing himself into the water? Stay tuned for updates on Novelbin. Amber laughed, I think we can manage to keep him dry. Matthew looked down at Maverick, who was now making excited noises at the mention of ducks, even though he had no idea what they were. All right then, ducks it is. Chapter 206. The walk down to the pond was peaceful, the morning sun filtering through the trees, casting dappled light on the stone pathways. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. The White House gardens were as grand as ever, maintained to perfection. But at this moment, it wasn't about diplomacy, power, or prestige, it was just about family. Maverick, perched securely in Matthew's arms, babbled excitedly as they neared the pond, his little hands flailed toward the water. As if he could reach out and touch the ripples, Amber carried a small cloth bag filled with breadcrumbs, smiling as she watched her son's enthusiasm. Looks like someone is excited. Matthew chuckled, adjusting Maverick on his hip. I don't even think he knows what he's excited for. As they reached the wooden bench near the water's edge, Matthew carefully sat down, placing Maverick on his lap. The little boy leaned forward, staring wide-eyed at the ducks gliding across the surface of the pond. A few of them quacked in greeting, their orange beaks opening and closing as they swam closer. Amber pulled out a small handful of breadcrumbs and handed some to Maverick. Here, sweetheart, just like this. She tossed a few crumbs into the water, and the ducks immediately swam toward them, nibbling greedily. Maverick watched, fascinated. Matthew held out a few crumbs to his son. Go on, buddy, give it a try. Maverick grasped the tiny pieces with his chubby fingers, staring at them for a long moment before shoving them directly into his mouth. Amber sighed, already expecting it. No, sweetheart, we feed the ducks, not ourselves. Matthew laughed as he gently pried the bread from his son's mouth. Well, work on that. After a few more tries and only one more attempt at eating the breadcrumbs, Maverick finally got the hang of it. He tossed the crumbs out, squealing with delight as the ducks gobbled them up. Every time one of them quacked, he clapped his hands, his tiny feet kicking in excitement. Amber shook her head, amused. You'd think he'd just discovered a new species. Matthew smirked. Well, in his little world, he probably did. They sat there for a long while, watching as Maverick continued his very serious job of feeding the ducks. Matthew found himself completely relaxed, his mind free from the usual weight of responsibility. Just his wife, his son, the ducks, nothing else mattered. By late morning, the warm sun had risen higher in the sky. Instead of heading back inside, Amber suggested they have a small picnic on the lawn. The staff quickly arranged a blanket under the shade of a large oak tree, setting out a simple basket of fruit, sandwiches, and pastries. Matthew stretched out on the blanket, leaning back on one arm while holding Maverick close with the other. Amber sat beside them, slicing a piece of apple into tiny bits for their son. Here you go, she said. Holding up a small piece, Maverick grabbed it, stuffing it in his mouth with a look of pure satisfaction. Matthew grinned, at least he knows how to eat this. Amber shot him a playful glare. Don't make fun of him, he's still learning. Maverick, oblivious to the conversation, happily chewed on his apple while kicking his little feet against his father's leg. Matthew leaned in closer to Amber. I could get used to this. She gave him a knowing smile. Good, because we're not done yet. Matthew raised an eyebrow. Oh? Amber gestured toward the White House stables in the distance. I thought we could take Maverick to see the horses. Matthew glanced at his son, who was now attempting to grab a strand of Amber's hair. Do you think he's ready for that? Amber smirked. He's a hesh, he can handle it. Matthew laughed. All right then, horses it is. The smell of hay and polished leather greeted them as they stepped inside the White House stables. Several fine horses were in their stalls, well-groomed and standing tall. One of the stable hands, an older gentleman named Jeremy, tipped his hat as he approached. Good afternoon, Mr. President, Mrs. Hesh. What brings you down here today? Amber smiled. We thought we'd introduce Maverick to the horses. Jeremy grinned. Starting him young, I see. That's good. Matthew shifted Maverick in his arms, letting the little boy look around. The child's eyes widened at the sight of the large creatures before him. One of the horses, a gentle brown mare, poked her head over the stall, sniffing curiously in their direction. Would you like to let him pet her? Jeremy asked. Matthew hesitated for a second but then nodded. Let's try it. Amber reached for Maverick's tiny hand, guiding it forward toward the mare's soft nose. The little boy's fingers barely brushed against the horse's fur before he let out a delighted squeal. Your next read is at Novelbin. Calm. Matthew chuckled. Well, I think he likes her. Jeremy laughed. Seems so. They spent the next few minutes letting Maverick get used to the animals, watching as he stared at them in awe. He reached out eagerly every time the mare came close. His tiny hands grabbing at the air. Amber beamed. One day, he'll be old enough to ride. Matthew shook his head, laughing. Let's focus on walking first. After some time, they finally made their way back toward the gardens, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. A quiet evening together. As the afternoon faded into evening, the family returned to the White House. Settling into the comfort of their private quarters, the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Matthew sat on the couch, Maverick curled up against his chest, his little body growing heavier with sleep. Amber sat beside them, flipping through a book, occasionally glancing up to watch the two most important people in her life. He's exhausted, Matthew murmured, gently rubbing Maverick's back. Amber smiled. It's been a big day for him. Matthew shifted slightly, adjusting his grip as Maverick's breathing slowed. For all of us. Amber reached out, brushing her fingers against Matthew's arm. Thank you for today. Matthew looked at her, his expression soft. I should be thanking you. You reminded me that there's more to life than meetings and policies. Amber leaned in, resting her head against his shoulder. That's what family is for. They sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of the world momentarily lifted. Maverick stirred slightly but remained nestled against his father. Matthew exhaled, closing his eyes briefly. I don't know what the future holds, Amber. But as long as I have you and Maverick, I think I can handle whatever comes next. Amber squeezed his hand. Well, face it together. And for the first time in months, Matthew felt at peace. The end of a perfect day. As night fell over Washington, D.C., the White House stood as it always had, grand, imposing, a symbol of power. But inside, in a quiet room away from the political turmoil and responsibilities, a husband and wife held their child close, enjoying the simple, irreplaceable gift of time together. Tomorrow, the world would demand their attention once more, but tonight, it belonged only to them. Chapter 207. The morning air was crisp and carried the scent of salt from the sea as President Matthew Hesh stood on the deck of a naval transport ship, watching the horizon as the imposing structures of the Newport Naval Base came into view. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden hue over the shipyard where dozens of steel-clad warships were in various stages of construction. Beside him, Secretary of the Navy Samuel Whitmore adjusted his coat against the breeze. The battleship program is proceeding ahead of schedule, Mr. President, he said, his voice filled with pride. By the end of the year, we will have at least 2 fully operational Dreadnought-class warships ready for deployment. Matthew nodded, his eyes fixed on the massive dry docks where skeletal frames of future battleships rose like metallic behemoths from the ground, the rhythmic pounding of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the distant shouts of shipbuilders filled the air, a symphony of industry and progress. How many are currently under construction? Matthew asked. Whitmore flipped through a small leather-bound notebook. We have 6 battleships in various stages. The USS Dominion and USS Liberty are nearing completion. Their armaments are being fitted as we speak. The USS Aegis and USS Valiant are still in their hull plating phase, while 2 additional unnamed battleships are in the early framework stage. Matthew crossed his arms. And their armament? Are we keeping up with the latest naval technology? Whitmore nodded. Absolutely. Each ship is being fitted with 14-inch naval guns, a step above most of what the European fleets are currently using. Our new armor plating is also more resistant to high-caliber shells. And we've incorporated improved steam turbine engines for greater speed and efficiency. Matthew glanced toward the massive steel turrets being lowered onto the USS Dominion. The sight of the heavy guns reinforced the reality of what Amarathia was becoming: a naval power capable of competing on the world stage. A small launch boat carried Matthew, Whitmore, and a few top military officials toward the heart of the shipyard. Workers paused momentarily, tipping their hats in acknowledgement as the president walked past towering cranes and stacks of raw steel. Rear Admiral Jonathan Monroe, the commanding officer of the Newport Naval Base, greeted them near the main drydock, a stout man with a thick mustache. Monroe had been instrumental in overseeing the expansion of the Navy. "Mr. President, it's an honor to have you here," Monroe said, shaking Matthew's hand firmly. "As you can see, we're making remarkable progress." Matthew glanced around, watching as workers riveted thick armor plates onto the hull of a battleship. "I can see that. How soon before we can conduct sea trials for the first of these ships?" Monroe gestured toward the USS Dominion, its sleek hull gleaming under the morning sun. "We're preparing for her first trials within the next 2 months. After that, if all goes well, she'll be commissioned into the fleet." Matthew nodded. "We need these ships ready as soon as possible. The world is changing, and Amarathia cannot afford to fall behind in naval superiority." Monroe gave a firm nod. "Understood. Sir, we've ramped up production capabilities. If we continue at this pace, Amarathia will have one of the strongest navies in the Western Hemisphere." One of the highlights of the visit was the demonstration of the new 14-inch naval guns, designed to outmatch any weapon currently in service. A special firing range had been set up on a nearby isolated stretch of coastline, where one of the completed turrets had been mounted for testing. Matthew, along with his entourage, was escorted to a reinforced observation post overlooking the test site. The gun crew was already in position, loading a 1,400-pound shell into the breech. A senior weapons engineer stepped forward. "Mr. President, this is our newest high-caliber naval gun, capable of firing up to 24 miles with remarkable accuracy." Matthew peered through a pair of binoculars as the engineers prepared for the test. "Fire when ready," Monroe ordered. A brief moment of silence. Then boom! The earth shook as the massive gun roared to life. A cloud of smoke and fire erupted from the barrel as the shell tore through the sky. Seconds later, a distant explosion sent a plume of water and debris high into the air. Matthew lowered his binoculars, impressed. "That will make any enemy think twice before challenging us." Whitmore grinned. "That's the idea, sir." Following the artillery demonstration, Matthew was led to a newly constructed naval officers' quarters, where he addressed a group of captains and admirals. The men stood at attention as he entered. "Gentlemen," Matthew began, his voice firm, "Amarathia is on the cusp of naval greatness. Our enemies will not wait for us to catch up, so we must be prepared. These battleships will be the backbone of our defense, ensuring that no nation underestimates us again." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the assembled officers. "I expect nothing but excellence from each of you," he continued. "Train your crews well, maintain your discipline, and uphold the values of Amarathia. If war comes, we will not be caught unprepared. Explore more adventures at Novelbin." A resounding, "Yes, sir," echoed through the hall. Satisfied, Matthew nodded. "Then let's get to work." As the day came to an end, Matthew took one last tour of the USS Dominion. Walking along the deck, he ran his fingers along the smooth steel railing, feeling the power and strength of the vessel beneath his hands. He paused at the bow, staring out at the open ocean. This was the future. Amarathia was no longer just a rising power, it was a force to be reckoned with. Whitmore stepped beside him. "What are you thinking, sir?" Matthew exhaled, watching the waves crash against the dock. "I'm thinking that soon, these ships will be sailing across the world, carrying the might of our nation with them." Whitmore smirked. "Then we'd better make sure they're ready." Matthew clapped him on the shoulder. "We will, because we don't just prepare for war, we ensure victory." As the presidential transport departed from the naval base, Matthew leaned back in his seat, his mind replaying the day's events. Amarathia was no longer just a nation on the rise, it was cementing itself as a power capable of defending its interests. The future of the Navy was secure now, he just had to ensure the rest of the world knew it. As the ship carried him back toward Washington, Matthew closed his eyes, knowing that his work was far from over. But today Today had been a victory. Chapter 208. President Matthew Hesh stepped onto the tarmac of Langley Air Base. The beating heart of Amarathia's growing air power rows of new aircraft gleamed under the sun. Their sleek frames a testament to the nation's engineering advancements. Waiting for him was General Alan McCarthy, commander of the Amarathian Air Corps, alongside Secretary of War Thomas Sinclair and several top-ranking officers. The mood was one of anticipation. This visit was more than a routine inspection. It was a declaration of Amarathia's ambition in the skies. Matthew adjusted his hat as he approached the group. "Gentlemen, I take it we have something worth showing today?" McCarthy grinned. "More than something, sir. We have the future of Amarathian air dominance." The hangar inspecting the future, they walked toward Hangar 12, the largest facility on the base, where inside, several prototype aircraft stood in pristine condition. Engineers and mechanics moved around them, performing final checks before the president's arrival. The first aircraft that caught Matthew's eye was the XF-1 Peregrine, a high-speed, twin-engine fighter designed to push the limits of aerial combat. McCarthy patted the sleek, metallic body of the plane. "The Peregrine is built for speed and maneuverability, sir. Top speed of 420 miles per hour, reinforced armor plating, and armed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and a pair of 20mm cannons. It will outmatch anything in the sky." Matthew ran a hand along the polished fuselage, nodding in approval. "Impressive. What's the operational range?" "Around 1,200 miles. But with drop tanks, we can extend it further, more than enough for fighter escort missions or deep strike raids." Secretary Sinclair folded his arms. "This is exactly the kind of firepower we need. The Europeans and Japanese have been pushing their air capabilities, cannot afford to fall behind." Matthew turned his gaze toward another aircraft, a massive four-engine bomber parked at the far end of the hangar. McCarthy smirked. "I see you've noticed the B-3 Warhawk, Mr. President." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "Tell me about it." "This is our new strategic bomber. It carries up to 12,000 pounds of explosives, has a range of 2,500 miles, and can fly at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The Warhawk is built to cripple enemy infrastructure before they ever reach the battlefield." Matthew studied the aircraft, his mind racing with possibilities. "How soon can we get them into mass production?" "We're already ramping up. First squadrons should be ready for deployment by next year." He turned to Secretary Sinclair. "We need to fast-track this. The moment another war breaks out, air superiority will decide the outcome before the first shot is fired." Sinclair nodded. "Agreed, sir. We're also working on expanding our airfields and training programs. We'll need thousands of pilots to fly these. Live demonstration air power in motion. Explore more adventures at Novelbin." Calm from the hangar, the group moved toward the main runway, where several aircraft were being prepared for a live demonstration. McCarthy handed Matthew a pair of binoculars. "Watch closely, Mr. President. This is what Amarathia's Air Force can do." Engines roared to life as a squadron of XF-1 Peregrine fighters taxied onto the runway. The ground crew signaled, and within seconds, the planes shot forward, their engines screaming as they ascended into the sky with incredible speed. The formation climbed rapidly before splitting into attack maneuvers on the ground. Gunners loaded anti-aircraft batteries with blanks, simulating enemy resistance. The fighters dived in, dodging imaginary flak, twisting and rolling through the sky with precision. Machine guns rattled, spitting tracer rounds at designated targets. Matthew couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This was power. This was Amarathia's future. A few minutes later, the B-3 Warhawk lumbered onto the runway, its massive wings casting a shadow over the tarmac. As soon as it reached speed, it lifted off with an almost effortless grace. Despite its size overhead, the bomb bay doors opened, and a dozen simulated bombs fell in sequence, striking marked targets on the test range. The ground rumbled as explosions erupted in precise formation. McCarthy grinned. "That, Mr. President, is the sound of victory." Matthew lowered the binoculars, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "We're going to need more of these." Following the demonstration, Matthew and his advisors returned to the base's strategy room, where a large map of Amarathia and its overseas territories was laid out. Matthew pointed to key locations on the map. "We can't just build planes, we need airbases, refueling stations, and radar networks. If we're serious about this, we need to expand our infrastructure." Sinclair agreed. We're already surveying locations for new air bases in the Caribbean, Pacific, and Alaska. We need forward positions for bomber squadrons. McCarthy added, the British and Germans have been testing early warning radar systems. If we integrate those into our air defenses, we'll be untouchable. Matthew nodded. Then make it happen. I want Amarathia's air force to be second to none. There was no room for hesitation. The world was changing, and Amarathia had to be ready. A moment of reflection looking to the future later that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Matthew stood on a balcony overlooking the airfield. The silhouettes of aircraft lined the runways, and in the distance, a squadron of fighters returned from their training exercises. Amber joined him, slipping her arm through his. You're thinking about the future again. She observed. Matthew exhaled. Always. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you ever worry about where this is all going? He hesitated before answering. We have no choice. If we don't build our strength, someone else will. I won't let Amarathia be left behind. Amber squeezed his hand. Just don't forget why you're doing this. Matthew looked out at the airfield, watching as the final aircraft touched down, its landing lights cutting through the evening haze. I want, he promised, because for Amarathia to thrive, it needed to soar higher than ever before, and Matthew Hesh would make sure of it. Chapter 209. It was an unusually quiet evening at the White House. For once, President Matthew Hesh had finished his duties ahead of schedule. He sat in his private study, staring at the radio, which had been playing a rerun of an old drama. The television in the corner was on, but it was broadcasting a familiar stage play, one he had already seen multiple times. Matthew sighed. Leaning back in his chair, entertainment felt stagnant. The radio had its limits, and while television was still a marvel of technology, it lacked the immersive experience he craved. Live theater performances were enjoyable, but they were nothing new. He needed something fresh, something different. Amber walked in, carrying Maverick in her arms. She noticed the restless expression on his face and smirked. Something on your mind? Matthew exhaled. I want something new in entertainment. I enjoy the radio, television, and theater, but it feels like I've exhausted all my options. I want something immersive, something bigger. Amber raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? Matthew's gaze sharpened as an idea took form. Cinema. Amber adjusted Maverick in her arms. Her curiosity piqued. Cinema? She repeated. What is cinema? Matthew leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with an idea still forming. Moving pictures, but more than just short silent clips. A full-length film with sound, music, and acting. A story told not on stage, but on a screen. Amber considered this for a moment. So a play, but recorded? More than that, Matthew said, standing and pacing the room. It wouldn't be limited to a single performance. We could craft large-scale productions, use different locations, create effects that aren't possible on a stage. It would be a completely new way of storytelling. Amber shifted Maverick to her other arm. I see the appeal, but is this even possible? We have television and radio, but moving pictures with synchronized sound? That sounds ambitious. Matthew smirked. We've accomplished everything we've set our minds to before. This will be no different. Amber sighed but smiled. Then I suppose you already have a plan. Matthew nodded. I do now. The following morning, Matthew arrived at Hesh Corporation's headquarters in Amsterdam, summoning his top executives for a meeting. The boardroom was filled with business strategists, engineers, and media specialists, every key figure necessary to turn his vision into reality. As he took his seat at the head of the table, the murmurs settled. Gentlemen, Matthew began, we have revolutionized radio and television, but now, we're going to do something even bigger. We're going to introduce cinema to the world. Read exclusive chapters at novelbin.com. Several executives exchanged glances, intrigued but unsure. David Calloway, head of the media division, was the first to speak. Sir, we've experimented with short moving pictures before, but those were brief, silent, and lacked real impact. Are you suggesting we turn them into something more commercial? Not just commercial, Matthew said. I want full-scale film production, actors, scripts, cameras capable of capturing both visuals and sound. I want to create an industry that rivals theater and television. A murmur spread through the room. Jacob Sinclair, one of the senior strategists, folded his hands. This would require an entirely new infrastructure, studios, production teams, specialized theaters, not to mention. The technology for synchronized sound is still being developed. Matthew nodded. Then we develop it. We start by building film studios and researching new cameras that can record both audio and motion. Okay, sir, what's the science behind it? This is how it works, Matthew began, his voice calm but firm. Motion pictures aren't actually moving, they're just a series of still images played in rapid succession. Right now, the short silent films we have use about 16 frames per second. Which is why they look choppy. If we increase the frame rate to 24 frames per second, the motion will be much smoother, more natural. The room was silent, absorbing his words. Jacob Sinclair, one of the strategists, adjusted his tie. Okay, that explains the visuals, but what about the sound? That's the real challenge, isn't it? Matthew nodded. That's where the real innovation happens. Right now, most moving pictures have no sound at all, and the ones that do use phonographs played alongside them, that method is unreliable. The audio often falls out of sync. I want sound recorded directly onto the film itself. David Calloway, head of the media division, frowned. How do you record sound onto film? Matthew smiled slightly. This was the part that would really change everything. We use a process called optical sound recording. The idea is simple. We convert sound waves into light patterns and store them on the edge of the film strip itself. When the film is played back, the projector reads these patterns and converts them back into audio. That way, the sound is always synchronized perfectly with the images. A murmur spread through the executives. Some were nodding, others scribbling notes. And how do we make that happen? Sinclair asked. We need to develop cameras and projectors that support this system. The current film cameras are too loud and bulky. If we record sound while filming, the camera noise will ruin everything. We need new cameras that are quieter, more compact, and capable of recording alongside our optical sound system. Matthew let that sink in before moving to the next challenge. Another thing, we start in black and white, but I want us to develop color film as well. Calloway's brow furrowed. Color? Isn't it decades away? Matthew shook his head. Not if we start working on it now. We can begin with hand-tinted scenes or colored frames, then transition to a true color film process. It's early, but the technology is within reach. Sinclair folded his arms. This is ambitious, sir. We'd need an entire industry, film studios, production teams, new theaters built to handle large screens and sound systems. Matthew nodded. Then we start building. Hesh Corporation will be the first to produce, distribute, and exhibit motion pictures worldwide. We control every part of the process, just like we did with radio and television. A long pause filled the room. Then, Calloway leaned back in his chair, a small smirk on his face. This is crazy, he said. But so was television, and we made that work. Matthew's smirk mirrored his. Then let's make cinema a reality. Chapter 210. The meeting had concluded, but for Matthew Hesh and his team, the real work was only just beginning. As the executives and engineers left the boardroom, the weight of their new endeavor settled on their shoulders. Cinema wasn't just an experiment, it was a full-scale industry being built from the ground up. Matthew didn't waste time. The moment the meeting ended, he called for immediate action. Enjoy more content from Novelbin. Calm, David, he said, turning to David Calloway, head of the media division. I need you to gather a team of writers, directors, and actors. We're going to need talent, not just stage performers, but people who can adapt to film. Calloway nodded. Well, start scouting immediately. Well, look at theater companies, radio performers, even unknown talent who can fit the vision. Good, Matthew said. And Jacob, he continued, looking at Jacob Sinclair, one of his senior strategists. I want a full production plan on my desk by next week. The sooner we start filming, the sooner we can perfect the process. Sinclair adjusted his tie. We'll need to build film studios, soundproofing equipment, and a pipeline for distribution. That will take time. Matthew nodded. Then let's not waste any. With that, the men dispersed, setting into motion one of the most ambitious projects in Amarathian history. The meeting had concluded, but for Matthew Hesh and his team, the real work was only just beginning. As the executives and engineers left the boardroom, the weight of their new endeavor settled on their shoulders. Cinema wasn't just an experiment, it was a full-scale industry being built from the ground up. Matthew didn't waste time. The moment the meeting ended, he called for immediate action. David, he said, turning to David Calloway, head of the media division. I need you to gather a team of writers, directors, and actors. We're going to need talent, not just stage performers, but people who can adapt to film. Calloway nodded. Well, start scouting immediately. Well, look at theater companies, radio performers, even unknown talent who can fit the vision. Good, Matthew said. And Jacob, he continued, looking at Jacob Sinclair, one of his senior strategists. I want a full production plan on my desk by next week. The sooner we start filming, the sooner we can perfect the process. Sinclair adjusted his tie. We'll need to build film studios, soundproofing equipment, and a pipeline for distribution. That will take time. Matthew nodded. Then let's not waste any. With that, the men dispersed, setting into motion one of the most ambitious projects in Amarathian history. The biggest hurdle wasn't the production or even distribution, it was the technology itself. Film cameras were loud and incapable of recording synchronized sound, which meant an entirely new camera system needed to be developed. Matthew spent the next few weeks working closely with the engineering team, pushing them beyond their limits. We need a camera that records both image and sound, without mechanical noise interfering with the audio, he told Charles Hewitt, the chief engineer overseeing the project. Hewitt sighed, rubbing his temples. The current film cameras are too bulky and loud. Even if we add soundproofing, the internal mechanics will still be audible. Matthew remained firm. Then redesign it. The engineering team spent days dismantling existing cameras, testing new components, and experimenting with noise reduction materials. The solution came in the form of a blimp Huizinga padded, insulated casing around the camera to dampen sound. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. Meanwhile, the optical sound system was being refined. The engineers successfully recorded the first synchronized audio test, a simple spoken phrase, followed by a short piano melody. When they played it back, and the sound matched the lips of the speaker on film perfectly, Matthew knew they were making progress. Now we scale it up, he ordered. Full production. With the technology advancing, the next step was creating the infrastructure to produce movies. Unlike radio and television, which could be recorded in controlled environments, cinema required large-scale production sets, proper lighting, and dedicated sound stages. Hesch Corporation purchased an abandoned warehouse in Amsterdam, transforming it into the first official film studio. The massive space was divided into multiple sections: a soundstage, a recording booth, and a workshop for building sets. Workers moved quickly, constructing towering backdrops, installing lighting rigs, and setting up early camera tracks for smooth panning shots. Matthew visited the site frequently, ensuring no detail was overlooked. He watched as carpenters built an entire street facade inside the warehouse. As lighting engineers positioned massive lamps to mimic natural sunlight, Sinclair joined him during one of the visits. We're essentially creating an entire city within a building, he said, shaking his head. That's exactly the point, Matthew replied. Films will take people to places they've never been without ever leaving their seat. With the studio nearly operational, Calloway and his team began casting actors. Traditional stage actors were the first choice, but many struggled with the transition. They're used to projecting their voices for a live audience, Calloway explained to Matthew after an early test. On film, that kind of overacting looks ridiculous. Matthew sighed. This was a new form of performance, one that had never existed before. Train them, he instructed. Bring in vocal coaches and acting instructors. They need to understand that film acting is different from theater. The first film-specific acting school was set up within the studio. Actors were taught how to move naturally on camera, how to deliver dialogue with subtlety, and how to work with microphones hidden in the set. It was slow, frustrating work, but progress was made. By the end of the month, they had a solid ensemble cast, actors who understood the new medium. With the studio built, cameras functional, and actors trained, the first true feature-length film was ready for production. Matthew personally approved the script, a simple romantic drama with elements of action, designed to showcase the new technology without overwhelming the audience. Filming began under intense scrutiny. The directors and cameramen struggled with lighting, camera angles, and sound recording. The microphones are too sensitive, one of the sound engineers complained. They're picking up background noise we never noticed before. Matthew observed the setup and quickly found the issue. Position the microphones above the actors, just out of the frame. That way, we capture the dialogue without interference. Small adjustments like these became the foundation of film language. After weeks of long days and late nights, the film was complete. Now came the final step: editing. Unlike television, which was performed live, film required cutting, splicing, and sequencing footage. It was tedious, but by the end of it, the first full-length feature film with synchronized sound was ready for screening. March 10, 1895. The first public screening was held at Hesh Grand Cinema, the first theater in Amarathia. Designed for motion pictures, high-ranking officials, business elites, and members of the press filled the auditorium. No one knew what to expect. Matthew sat in the front row, Amber beside him. He glanced at the packed house, feeling the weight of the moment. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered to life. A young man appeared on screen, walking into a grand ballroom. The audience watched, expecting silence. Then, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." A gasp rippled through the crowd. For the first time in history, a moving picture spoke. The film continued, dialogue flowed naturally, music swelled, perfectly in sync with the motion. The audience sat enthralled, completely immersed. When the film ended, there was a long pause. Then, thunderous applause. Matthew exhaled. They had done it. David Calloway turned to him, a wide grin on his face. "You just changed the world." Matthew smirked. "Not just me, we did." Cinema had arrived, and it was only the beginning.